The Chernobyl meltdown, a disaster with lasting environmental consequences. On April 26th of 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant located near Pripyat, Ukraine, became the site of the worst nuclear disaster in history. The explosion of Reactor 4 released massive amounts of radioactive material into the air, creating an environmental catastrophe with consequences still felt today. The disaster was caused by a combination of reactor design flaws, unsafe testing procedures, and human error. The Soviet-designed RBMK-1000 reactor had a serious flaw. Instead of stabilizing during low-power operation, it became dangerously unstable. On the night of the accident, operators were conducting a safety test to see if the reactor could provide enough power to keep the cooling system running in case of an emergency shutdown. In preparation for the test, they turned off key safety systems, including the emergency cooling system. Additionally, they lowered the reactor's power output too much, putting it in an unstable state. When they tried to restart the reactor by inserting control rods, an unexpected power surge occurred. Within seconds, the fuel rods overheated, the coolant turned to steam, and pressure built up uncontrollably. At 1:23 a.m., a massive steam explosion blew the 200-ton reactor lid off, shattering the building and exposing the reactor core. A second explosion followed, igniting a fire that burned for 9 days and sent a radioactive cloud into the atmosphere. 2 plant workers were killed instantly by the blast. Firefighters arrived without proper protection, exposing themselves to lethal doses of radiation. Many died within weeks from acute radiation syndrome, ARS. The Soviet government initially downplayed the disaster, delaying evacuation of Pripyat's 50,000 residents for 36 hours. By then, they had already been exposed to dangerously high radiation levels. The explosion released 400 times more radioactive material than the Hiroshima bomb, spreading fallout over Europe. The radioactive release contaminated vast areas of land, air, and water. The explosion released iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90, which contaminated soil, water, and the food chain. Winds carried radioactive particles as far as Sweden, France, and even Canada. The nearby Red Forest received such high radiation that its trees turned orange and died within days. Many animals perished from extreme exposure, while others experienced genetic mutations and reproductive issues. Over time, some species like wolves, lynxes, and bison have flourished in the absence of humans, despite persistent radiation risks. Strontium-90 and cesium-137 remain in soil and river sediments, making agriculture unsafe in the most contaminated areas. The Pripyat River, which feeds into the Dnieper River, a major water source for Ukraine, carried radioactive material downstream. Tens of thousands of people were forced to permanently evacuate. Thyroid cancer rates spiked, especially in children, due to iodine-131 contamination in milk and food. The Soviet Union spent billions on containment efforts, hastening its economic decline. Many lessons were learned from Chernobyl, such as the fact that nuclear safety regulations must be strict and enforced to prevent future disasters. Long-term environmental contamination shows how ecosystems struggle, but sometimes recover in extreme conditions. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone is an unexpected wildlife refuge, demonstrating both the resilience and fragility of nature. Since the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, CEEZ, has become a unique long-term study site for scientists observing how ecosystems respond to extreme radiation exposure and the absence of human interference. Over the years, researchers have documented drastic environmental shifts, including changes in decomposer activity, plant growth, animal mutations, and surprising ecological adaptations. For decades after the disaster, scientists noticed an unnatural accumulation of plant matter, dead trees, leaves, and organic material that would typically be broken down by decomposers such as bacteria, fungi, and insects. Radiation suppressed decomposer populations, slowing the breakdown of organic material. The result was a buildup of highly flammable biomass, increasing the risk of radioactive wildfires, which have since spread contamination. More recently, decomposer communities have begun recovering, with microbial activity increasing, though still lower than in non-contaminated ecosystems. The CEZ has become an accidental wildlife refuge due to the absence of human activity despite persistent radiation exposure. While some species struggled or disappeared, others have adapted in surprising ways. Barn swallows and other birds have shown higher rates of physical mutations such as deformed beaks, asymmetrical wings, and abnormal feather growth. Some rodents, like voles, have developed radiation-resistant cellular repair mechanisms, allowing them to survive higher radiation levels. Wolves, lynxes, and brown bears have thrived, possibly due to the lack of human hunting, despite genetic damage being observed in some populations. Eurasian lynxes, European bison, and wild boars have made a resurgence in the zone, some returning to areas they had long disappeared from. Wolves in the CEZ are 7 times more abundant than in surrounding areas, showing that the lack of human pressure outweighs radiation risks. Horses of Przewalski, a rare and once nearly extinct wild horse species, have thrived in the zone, demonstrating resilience despite occasional radiation exposure. While many plants have recovered, their adaptation has not come without costs. Genetic mutations in plants such as pine trees and soybeans have been observed, leading to altered growth rates, stunted development, and increased susceptibility to environmental stress. The red forest, one of the most heavily contaminated areas, initially saw trees die en masse. However, new forests of radiation-resistant species like birch and aspen have since regrown. Sunflowers and soybeans in the zone show increased DNA repair mechanisms, suggesting natural selection is favoring radiation-resistant traits. Certain fungi, including species like Cladosporium sphaerospermum, have been found growing inside reactor ruins, feeding on radiation itself using melanin-based radiotrophic processes. Bee and insect populations, initially devastated, are rebounding, though with lower diversity in the most radioactive areas. The Chernobyl exclusion zone remains a paradox, a place where radiation still poses risks, but life freed from human interference has shown remarkable resilience. The long-term evolutionary effects are still being studied, but the CEZ provides a rare look at how nature can adapt to extreme conditions. Humans may have started the story, but nature, left to its own devices, is revealing how life persists, adapts, and evolves in the wake of catastrophe. In Chernobyl, one of recovery, adaptation, and cautionary lessons for future environmental stewards.